Well, I'd like to ask a little bit about your early life. You're a Pennsylvania native.
That's correct. That's
Uh,
correct.
what was your early life like? Who were the major influences in your life back
Well, not surprisingly, my parents and my family were fundamentally influential. I grew up in a railroaders household. Everyone in Altoona, Pennsylvania was affiliated in one way or another with the Pennsylvania Railroad. My dad was a fireman and then eventually an engineer. So we lived by the railroad clock. It was a good blue-collar, solid, working-class neighborhood and family. They were good Presbyterians and good work ethic and high expectations. So their influence continues to be very important for me. Like a lot of people who managed to get through the Depression, nothing was more important to them than that their children would somehow have a better life than they had, and I've been deeply grateful for that all my life.
Were there any ministers in the family?
No ministers in the family at all. Interestingly, my dad's family were Methodists. My mother's deeply Presbyterian, so we became Presbyterian, and ministers at our Presbyterian church played a role in my life, but not in our family.
Well, what led you into the ministry? A lot of people talk about, the call to ministry. Others find it as kind of an accidental pathway.
Great question. People often want to know at what point in your life did you know, and for me, the call to ministry was a long process, which in many ways continues to this day, and not a single event. I was always comfortable in the church of my childhood, liked being around it, but as I matured, began to ask substantive intellectual questions about faith and belief and credibility, and is this stuff true, and was compelled by the fact that Christian faith is intellectually challenging, and that the older I got, the more I realized that some of the most brilliant people in history were also compelled by the notion of God and by the Christian faith, and so it was in that way it was kind of a circuitous route, but it led me to the University of Chicago Divinity School, where a college advisor told me you could go without any risk to your future. They didn't particularly care whether you became a minister or not. They provided a theological education. Anyhow, I find myself being hooked intellectually and spiritually by the intellectual and academic rigor and honest faithfulness of the Divinity School.
So it occurred to you, it occurred in college. Is that fair to say?
Yes. Probably before then I was thinking about what to do with my life. I was kind of avoiding the notion of ministry. I didn't particularly want anything to do with it, but a college advisor said, Buchanan, the kind of questions you're asking, why don't you take a year off and go to divinity school? You'll never have an opportunity like this again. It was between Korea and Vietnam, so there was no imminent war to go fight. So I took a year and came to the University of Chicago, and that's where I became hooked.
Your ministry led you into, I believe, Indiana and Ohio after that? Traditional kind of thing?
Yes, very traditional. In fact, during divinity school, my wife and I moved to Dyer, Indiana, to a very small church, but it provided housing and a couple of dollars a week, and I decided to give it a try, and we stayed there for 6 years and learned a lot about ministry and people and a lot about the church, and then moved on from there to Lafayette, Indiana, Purdue University, edge of the city congregation of young adults and kids, and so I've been pretty much involved in traditional Presbyterian parishes all my life.
And you came here in 1985, is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
It's quite a jump up from the smaller churches.
Well, actually the church I came from was the downtown church in Columbus, Broad Street Presbyterian Church, which is one of the great Presbyterian congregations for many years, located right in the heart of Columbus. It was not as large as this church, but it was a substantial congregation and continues to be so today.
So it gave you good preparation.
Yes, it did. It was a multiple staff church with a good tradition of music and outreach into the neighborhood.
How did your personal journey with the ministry continue over the years or grow over the years? You've been described as someone who's very much known for his inclusivity, who really wants to bring people in and at the same time take the church out to face the challenges that face the community.
As is the case with a lot of people my age, the compelling concept for me as I was developing as a young minister was the notion of racial inclusivity. We woke up in college to the notion of racism. It had just been an unconscious part of the life of this nation and our culture and my own life, and suddenly, in fact, it was in a college fraternity when someone suggested that we receive a young African American man, and everyone went ballistic, including the National Fraternity Headquarters. Anyhow, that was a sobering experience for me. And then, of course, the Civil Rights Movement emerged while I was in University Divinity School, and I became deeply involved in the life of a multiracial parish on the south side of Chicago, and deeply committed to the Civil Rights Movement. So my notion of Christianity as kind of a public faith, and the church as a player in society, was nurtured and formed in those exciting and difficult days.
Well, you have an interesting, in talking with people here, like Rabbi Shalman, who was a laureate a few years ago, Marty, and others who've been active in the religious life of this community. It's really taken on a vitality here in the last couple of dozen years as the churches and the synagogues and so on have really started to have a public life here in the community of Chicago.
I think that's one of the unique things about this community. There's a healthy interfaith dialogue or conversation that's been going on for many years. It's become incredibly important in the last years, and fortunately Chicago has been blessed by people like Rabbi Shalman and Marty, who for years and years have understood that we need to know one another and talk to one another in this nation.
Here at Fourth Presbyterian, you've had an active outreach for a number of years. It looks like it goes back prior to your coming here. How intrinsically, how much of an intrinsic part of the outreach of this church is kind of botch the question there a little bit, but outreach is vital to this church, it seems.
It could not be more vital. In fact, that's a great question, because in the 60s, while I was in divinity school, and a lot of urban churches were responding with fear to the urban unrest, the student unrest, and a lot of major metropolitan churches were closing their doors or locking their doors up tight. My predecessor, a great Welshman by the name of Elam Davies, did the exact opposite and opened the doors to this fairly elite, wealthy church, and brought in neighbors, brought in youngsters from Cabrini Green, started a counseling center. All of that, I think, in a wonderful way, refocused the attention of this church from itself to the world, where it ought to be anyhow. And in the process, of course, it was controversial. Some people didn't like that, didn't think the church had any business doing that sort of thing, but it's my opinion that it saved this church's soul. And to this day, this church is shaped and formed by a gospel that just simply demands to be expressed outside in the streets of the city. So it could not be more important to us.
So for you, it seems like a perfect fit.
Thank you for saying that. I think that every day. I think there just couldn't be a better place for me to be in ministry than here.
You've written extensively about that. You have a couple of books to that on that subject. I believe Being Church, Becoming Community.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Sermons for the City. Churches have to become actively engaged in the city, in the communities. That's the message you take to other ministers.
That is the message. If we know anything here, it is that, and it goes right to the heart of the Christian faith. We're told that the way to live out this business is to somehow figure out a way to give your life away, and I think that applies institutionally as well as personally. That we need to live on behalf of and for the sake of something other than our own security or amusement or even our own happiness. We're called to get it out there into the streets. And I just think there's a dynamic set off when churches and individuals begin to do that is energizing and enlivening and compelling. One of the amazing things about this place is that people come here because of that. They come here because they know when they sit in the pews of this place and put their money in the plate, it's going to make a difference in the quality of life in the world around us.
Well, that was one of the figures I saw. It was something like 40% of what the church's, I don't know if you would call it income, but funds go to the outreach ministries here.
Right.
That's a huge part. And I've been in churches before, and that's a large part of the.
It's a major commitment, and has been for many years, and continues to grow. It's not a diminishing thing. We continue to invest more and more of our emotional energy and our resources in our neighbors.
Could you describe a little bit about what programming you have out there? I know through Chicago Lights, you have the Elam Center, you have a number of different things out there, tutoring programs in Cabrini Greens.
Well, Cabrini Green, the proximity of Cabrini Green, a mile or so to the west of us, has been a defining element for this church. That's under transition right now. The whole Chicago Housing Authority is, but that proximity helped us define our mission, and so. My predecessor invited African American youngsters, mainly African American youngsters from Cabrini, into the church for tutoring. When I came, we realized that was something that we needed to do even more of and take more seriously, so we expanded that program from about 100 youngsters to about 450. And retained professional leadership for it, professional educators, and so it's now a very sophisticated tutoring program which brings into this wonderful Gothic building 400 plus youngsters from Cabrini and other urban neighborhoods now. We rent buses and haul kids in for an hour and a half or 2 hours of one-on-one tutoring with a volunteer once a week. That's important. We have a scholarship program for outstanding youngsters in that program, assuring them that if they can do it and want to do it, we'll stand with them as they go on to private schools or to higher education. We have a summer program that does the same thing for 150 or so youngsters. That, in addition to the Social Service Center, which deals with the homeless and needy in this high rent district. There are a lot of homeless people. And for a lot of them, this church is where they can count on being welcome, where they can count on facilities to use, and a hot meal, and a coat if they need it, and a referral if they need it, and mostly just a hospitable, you're welcome here.
I noticed that a little earlier as we were doing some shots around the building. It was pretty clear that there were some homeless people here, and they seemed completely at ease here.
Yes. And we're glad for that. We're grateful for them. Many of them are in various programs at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, so they're people who are not particularly well physically, and we're just privileged to be able to be here for them.
I'd like to turn a little bit to some of your other work with the Christian Century magazine. Mm-hmm. I like the mission statement you have about Christians. I can't even read my own writing here, but to a profound engagement with the world, with both the head and heart. It seems like what you're all about.
Well, once again, it was a match made in heaven, if you will. I've been a reader of the Christian Century and have loved what they have been doing and have meant to the world for my entire ministry. So it was a great privilege to be invited to be part of that enterprise. And yes, they do engage heart and head, and we try to bring to print the very best thinking about the complicated theological and social and political issues of the day, but always rooted in the basic good news of the Christian faith, of God's love in Jesus Christ.
What I like about it is, in some of the readings I've done, is you seem to have the central tenet that Christians don't function in a vacuum. The faith doesn't function in a vacuum. It lives in the real world.
That's right. That's very much a part of the tradition of this church. It's also very much at the heart of the Presbyterian Reformed tradition, that Christian faith doesn't call us out of the world, but in a very real way calls us into the world in the name of Christ. So we're not a closeted, cloistered version of Christianity. We're worldly. We got the doors and windows open, and we feel that we need to be out there engaged in the world.
With the magazine, I'm just looking at some of the topics online today. For example, you're covering ground in some controversial areas like the U.S. military bases across the world and the presence, and how that's viewed by other countries, other peoples. That's some pretty tough stuff.
Well, and it's not everybody's cup of tea. There are people who would, and I respect this point of view, who just simply don't want religion to be too tightly engaged in the world. We come at it from the very opposite direction. That in order to be faithful, you are called to be engaged. We try not to be doctrinaire or dogmatic. We try not to say this is the Christian position on that issue or this issue. What we say is that we are called as Christians to be careful and discerning and thoughtful, and to bring our faith to bear on the whole range of issues. And you bet they're controversial. And for that very reason, sometimes people don't want you to mention them. But we think that's what we're called to do.
Yeah, and some of the other articles I found very thoughtful, very provocative. Of course, the recent review of the new book on Mother Teresa's life,
Yes.
Be My Light,
Right.
And how someone who is being canonized for her good works has had so many years in an arid desert without feeling the presence of God.
Right. Right. Well, that's an intriguing metaphor, I think, for what it means to be a postmodern or a modern Christian, if you will. People want certainty, and there are a lot of things about which we can't be certain. And what Christians are called to do is they're not called to certainty, they're called to trust. And that's what Mother Teresa did. She trusted God and gave her all. Even in the darkest nights of the soul, she kept right on loving people in God's name. And we think I think that's a great metaphor for what faithfulness is.
You've been in leadership positions, obviously, within your faith in national organizations.
Mm-hmm.
You've also been representative of the World Council of Churches. Speak to me about that dimension of your life.
Well, I've always been just very grateful for my ecclesiastical tradition, the Presbyterian tradition, and so I've always appreciated it, respected what it has meant in the life of the world, and the life of this nation particularly. We've been here for a long time, deeply involved from the earliest days of pre-colonial or pre-revolutionary days. So it was a great privilege to be elected to be moderator of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church, which is kind of the symbolic head of the denomination for a year. And I had the opportunity to travel throughout the country, visiting Presbyterians coast to coast, but also throughout the world, the Presbyterian partners in mission and our own mission personnel. And that was just a wonderful opportunity and a deeply moving affirmation of the continuing role of Christian church in the life of the world.
You've had a richly varied career in the church, and a lot of challenges. What's next for you? What subject intrigues you? What would you like to do next?
Well, I'm deeply committed to that Christian Century magazine. I'm deeply committed to the notion of joining heart and mind. And I have a sense that there are lots and lots of people out there who are hungry for that kind of encounter and that kind of resource. So I'm hopeful that I'll continue to do that. I think I've got some important work to do here. This church is growing; it's expanding beyond the boundaries of the building, and we need to strengthen this church for the next generation. And then, when that's done, I'll get out of the way.
Let's talk briefly about the church itself, the church building here. It's a marvelous structure.
Well, it's a
historic.
great story. It's just a great story. John Timothy Stone, who was the new minister here in 1909, struck a deal with the leaders of the church. He said, I'll come from Baltimore, where it's very successful and very comfortable, if you'll agree to build a grand church building. The legend around here is that he said the grandest Gothic building west of the Alleghenies. So they did it. They bought an unlikely piece of property on a dirt road outside here, not much around, and retained the premier Gothic architect of the day, Ralph Adams Cram, and built this stunning neo-Gothic building, which of course now sits in the middle of one of the more interesting and dynamic neighborhoods in the world. It's a great building, and as hundreds of people every day come in and just look, and it's such a surprise in the midst of this busy urban neighborhood to have this little Gothic jewel.
It's rich with symbolism in a very real way, isn't it?
Yes. Well, and it symbolizes for me this incarnational gospel that calls us to be the body of Christ right in the world. And here we are with our doors open and with our garden outside and people coming and going all day long.
I'm gonna let the vehicle pass there for just a little bit.
That's a urban hazard.
Yeah, yeah. Well, if you're taping in my part of the state, it's usually somebody with a bad muffler.
The most hazardous thing that happens here on Sunday morning is Sunday morning, a favorite time for helicopters to deliver heavy machinery to the top of high-rise, air conditioning and heating.
Yeah.
And invariably, during the 8 o'clock service, you'll hear the whomp of
you hear the sky crane go by.
helicopter.
One question. I know the church, of course, is far more than the physical building, but what's it like to preach in a place like this?
Well, it's a great and humbling honor, which fills me with gratitude and a little fear and trembling every week of my life. One of the amazing things about this place historically is that people come here for serious reasons. You don't have to go to church anymore, and you particularly don't have to go to church in the city. There's a lot of wonderful things to do on Sunday morning, so people come here with business in mind. They want to hear something that's worth listening to. They come here with high intentionality, and that just, I want to say inspires me, but it fills me with a sense that this is we're engaged here. It's very important.
Yeah, there's a real responsibility.
Absolutely.
I think I'm pretty much at the end of my questions. Is there anything I haven't touched upon?
Oh, I don't think so. It's been fun.
Same here. Same here.